All right, let's get back to it. We're going to talk about police and society. Essentially, this chapter is going to get us into the history and organization of policing in the United States. The origin of American policing comes from English policing, of course. It's based on the pledge system, where tithing, hue and cry, hundreds and constables were mainstay. Individuals who lived primarily in rural areas were responsible for aiding neighbors and protecting settlements from thieves and marauders. This is known as the pledge system. So you're pledging to protect each other. As the population grew and became more dense, families and groups of 10 were organized into tithings. The members of these tithings were responsible for handling their own problems. But if there were some serious problems that they couldn't take care of, they were expected to make a hue and cry, which is essentially a call for assistance. 10 tithings were organized into a unit called 100. Policing issues were handled by constables who were appointed by noblemen. Constables might be considered the first real police officers and still referred to as such in contemporary England. Shires, which are analogous to modern-day counties, were organized and controlled by a shire reeve. The shire reeve was appointed by the crown or a local landowner to supervise and police the shire. The shire reeve is the forerunner to the modern-day sheriff. As you can see, shire and sheriff are certainly drawn from similar roots. During the 13th century, the watch system was created, to help protect the property in England, cities and towns. As property became more important, the protection of it became important as well. Watchmen patrolled the city at night to protect the community against robberies, fires, and disturbances. Watchmen reported to the constable in larger cities. Watchmen were organized within church parishes, and usually the members of the parish performed watchman duties. But in 1326, the Office of Justice of the Peace was created to assist the shire reeve in controlling the county. These justices performed judicial functions in addition to their primary role as peacekeepers. The local constable became the assistant to the justice of the peace and conducted investigations, served summonses, executed warrants, and secured prisons. This system helped establish the relationship between the police and the judiciary, which we know continues today. There were also private police and what are referred to as thief takers. Private police were universally corrupt. They legitimately earned money by catching thieves and returning stolen property to victims. They illegitimately earned money by receiving stolen property, i.e. fencing, theft, perjury, and blackmail. So they were running both sides of the game. As we know, there was no control over private policing. They were just criminally deviant as the people they were hired to apprehend. They were as criminally deviant as the people they were hired to apprehend. And it left private policing less than wanted in many respects. Another important figure, Henry Fielding and the Bow Street Runners. Henry Fielding, Saunders Welch, and John Fielding sought to clean up the thief-taking system. Henry was appointed to magistrate in 1748 and operated his own group of non-profit-making police out of the Bow Street area in London. His agents were carefully trained and controlled and exercised only legitimate powers. They eventually became known as the Bow Street Runners. So all of a sudden, you see ethics and morals and right and wrong being brought to institutions, growing institutions that were performing policing within local areas. This leads to the creation of a public police. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act was passed. Peel worked diligently to organize a highly ethical police force. Once again, ethics coming in. One of his primary goals was to standardize and objectify the policing response, so that constables working throughout London would respond similarly to similar situations. So you get some standardization within how people are being policed, which is important when you're wanting to construct a criminal justice system somewhere down the line. First organized police force, more than 1,000 men. They were paramilitary, and they were still largely corrupt and unsuccessful. The early Metropolitan Police Department suffered some of the same problems as the previous policing agencies. Corruption was a constant problem, and corruption still is a problem in policing. In the early years, about 1/3 of the bobbies were dismissed for corruption, cowardice, or alcoholism each year. And unfortunately, law enforcement in colonial America paralleled the British model, with its successes and with its failures. Law enforcement in colonial America ultimately is patterned after the English model and English history. Sheriffs become the primary policing officers. Sheriffs were the original paid law enforcement officers. They were primarily reactionary, meaning that they responded to calls for assistance but did not proactively seek to prevent crime. And they collected taxes. They were paid on a fee system, received a fixed amount for every arrest made. But in the end, tax collecting duties were way more lucrative. Slave patrols in certain southern states served as an initial foundation for colonial enforcement. In rural areas, slave patrols sought to recapture runaway slaves. This practice was often, as you can imagine, as you've seen in movies, read about in historical accounts, it was brutal and it was violent. And then, of course, you have vigilantes in Western territories. Lawlessness was often responded to by the formation of vigilante committees. These committees hired vigilantes to track down notorious lawbreakers. So Hammurabi's Code, an eye for an eye, is certainly working well in Western developing areas, or developing areas in the western part of the United States. Just as in England, the need for formal policing arose from an increase in urban mob violence. As we mentioned earlier, the Boston Police Force was developed in 1838, New York in 1844, and Philadelphia in 1854. And they were developed because of this growing urbanization that was happening and the crime that was following this growth in urbanization. Some early police agencies, they formed in reference to political appointees being appointed as officers. Early officers were appointed by the political party or machine that was in power at the time. It was not uncommon for police officers to have more allegiance to their political party than to the general public, because that's who assured their job. That's who paid them. Even so, the job was highly desirable because it paid better than most blue-collar jobs at the time. it was also less physically demanding than working in the factories. Training became standardized, procedures which were non-existent created problems, and it resulted in a lack of centralized record keeping, and most officers patrolled on foot without ability to call for backup. So the early systems, even though they were starting to realize the need for standardization, they were still very disorganized, and the disorganization created problems for policing. The primary function of early police officers was the order of maintenance, not crime control. Remember, they're not out looking for crime, they're responding to it. And the order to be maintained was often dictated by the political parties at the time. So because of this lack of training and supervision, the police were essentially incompetent to do their jobs and ultimately became corrupt. They were generally disliked by everyone that they served. And although it was a better paying job, it often seemed to be a thankless one. Of course, the early police forces adapt emerging technologies for their use. Things like the telegraph, bicycles, motorcycles, motorized vehicles all become part of policing. After the Civil War, the police began focusing more attention on crime fighting and less on ordered maintenance. Even so, most police agencies were essentially enforcers for the dominant political parties. Still, the political influence over policing would remain dominant until the early part of the 20th century. This is where party becomes important. The Chicago machine that ruled politics in the state of Illinois, especially the city of Chicago, also ruled the police, and that was extremely important. As a result of all the disorganization, you see the emergence of professionalism. Concerns about corruption essentially lead to citizens' oversight boards over political influence of policing. In the late 1800s, state legislators removed control of the police from local governments. By the end of that century, most cities had regained control over their police forces. There's an important strike in 1919 when the Boston police strike happened. The strike was based on dwindling social status of police officers. Pay, of course, had not kept pace with inflation. The Boston police officers attempted to unionize in response. And in response to that, Governor Calvin Coolidge mobilized the state militia as a response. So when the public support turned against the police, the striking officers were fired and replaced with new recruits. But despite its lack of success, the strike did call attention to the ineffectiveness of police and the need for some new standards and a push towards professionalism, especially at the national level. There are two police chiefs that are extremely important in this process. August Vollmer, the chief of Berkeley Police Department in California, he encouraged the police to require university training. He led efforts towards the use of science in crime detection, and he argued for standardizing training.